Okay, good evening, everyone. Tonight's Parsha class has been sponsored or is sponsored by Leanne Portnoy. This week of learning has been sponsored by Leanne Portnoy in memory of her mother, Tzivia Bas Henach. And tonight's class is also sponsored by John and Eleanor Perlman as a merit for Refuah Shalema for their brother David Ben Chaya Rivka. And may this class be a merit for Shleimer for all those who are ill, and a merit that we quickly be rescued from this very difficult situation that we find ourselves in now due to COVID-19. So this week's Parsha is Bamidbar, Tafshin Pei, and we will start from the beginning of the Parsha. Perek Aleph, Pasuk Aleph. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Bamidbar Sinai b'Olam Hayed. Hashem spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert, in the tabernacle, in the Mishkan, Be'echad la'chodesh hasheni, on the first day of the second month, Hashana Hashenis of the second year, let's say some may Eretz Mitzrayim Lamar, to their leaving the land of Egypt, saying. And in the next pasuk, the pasuk says, pasuk Beis tells us how Hashem tells Moshe to count the Jewish people. We're going to focus on this first pasuk, and we're going to discuss a medrash. The Medrash focuses on the words, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Bamidbar Sinai. Hashem spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert. And the Medrash asks, Lama Bamidbar Sinai? Why in the Sinai desert? The commentary on the Medrash, called Eitz Yosef, explains that the Medrash's question of why is really, why does the verse have to tell us that Hashem spoke to Moshe in the desert of Sinai? We know that's where the Jewish people were encamped. Why does the Torah have to mention Bamidbar Sinai, that Hashem spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert? And therefore, the Medrash understands that the focus here is on the fact that Hashem spoke to Moshe in a desert. And the Medrash continues, Mikan Shanu Chachamim, it's here that the sages taught, B'shlosha Devarim Nitna Torah. The Torah was given with three things. There were three things given. When the Torah was given together with three other things. Together meaning while three other things were present. There were three things that were present when Hashem gave the Jewish people the Torah. Ba'esh, he gave the Torah with fire. Uvamayim, Hashem gave the Torah to the Jewish people with water. Bamidbar, and he gave it to them in the desert. These were the things the Torah was given with. Ba'esh, how do we know the Torah was given with fire? The answer is, Bahar Sinai Hashem Kulai. In Parsha Yisrael, where the Torah tells us about the giving of the Torah describes, and Mount Sinai was smoking, was ablaze in a fire. That's where we know that the Torah was given with fire. Uvamayim minayin, how do you know the Torah was given with water? Shenemar, because the pasuk says, Gam shamayim natafu gam avim natfu moyim. This is a pasuk in the book of Shoftim, in the book of Judges. It reads, also the heavens dripped, also the clouds dripped water. And this means to say that there was a rain, a mist, that was Bamidbar and in the desert. That's the third thing. The third thing the Torah was given with is a desert. How do we know that? Because in our Parsha it states, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Bamidbar Sinai. Hashem spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert. Now, there's a question we can ask on this right away, and I don't have an answer for it, is that if we need to know that the Torah was given in a desert, we don't need our Parsha to say that. In Parsha Yisrael, we know the Jewish people were encamped in the Sinai desert when Hashem gave them the Torah. Why the Medrash chooses our Parsha, a verse from our Parsha to point that out, I don't know. But we're going to focus on this idea that the Medrash says the Torah was given three things, with fire, with water, and in a desert. These were the three things present when the Torah was given. So now the Medrash continues. V'lama nitna b'shlosh devarim halalu. And why was the Torah given with these three things? Elama elu chinam l'chobeya ha'olam. Just as these things are free to all the people in the world, Kach divrei Torah chinam hein. So too the words of Torah are for free. And Medrash quotes a verse to point this out. So according to the Medrash is saying that these three things together bring out an idea that the Torah is free. Water is free. I mean, yeah, we pay for water nowadays, but essentially water should be free. There is enough water all over. Fire is free. Fire is available to get. And the desert is typically considered something ownerless. If you want to go to the desert, you want to be in the desert, you don't have to pay for anything to be there. So the same way that these three elements are for free, so the Torah is for free. The Torah is available and open for anyone to come and to study its words. And it's available. They're not something you have to pay for. For the Jewish people, the Torah is available for any Jew who wants to come and study and to live by it. Now, the commentary of Eitz Yosef understands that, we don't necessarily need three elements like this to teach us this lesson. It's true there's a common denominator between all three, which is what the Medrash is pointing out. There also needs to be a reason for each one of these elements alone. What is the meaning behind each element individually? The fact that the Torah was given with each one means there was a reason for it. And therefore, the Eitz Yosef gives an explanation as to why exactly these three. What does each element mentioned symbolize? What message does it have? I'm going to share with you the Eitz Yosef and two other explanations to what symbolism lies behind these elements that Torah was given with. So the Eitz Yosef, when he explains the three, what each thing represents, he explains, and I'll share with you how I understand it. He says, "Sheyeru ba'esh al tzerech dakus haseichel." The fact that it was given with fire means that a person has to have dakus haseichel. The word dak means something very fine. And my understanding, it means that for Torah, a person has to be able to have a certain way of looking at things in the abstract. Torah is not something like fire is not substantive. There's no substance to fire. Substantive. I don't know if that's the right word. Sorry, but doesn't have substance. And the point here is that Torah isn't going to be something of substance in the sense that it's something that it's obvious and it's clear. A person has to think in a certain deep and abstract way in order to be able to understand the concepts of the Torah. It's not these simple, mundane concepts. It's very deep concepts. A person needs to have a dakas haseichel. A person has to be ready to think deep and to think somewhat in the abstract to be able to understand the holy concepts of the Torah. And that's what's represented by fire, something that's not substantive. And then he says water. What does water represent? So now he says water actually represents the idea that water is something that flows and rushes. It's something that shows energy. It's something that shows that can come along very fast and flow very fast and very powerful. Water represents the idea of energy, that a person has to put an effort and be energetic when it comes to studying and living by Torah. And the third thing is a desert. And on this, the Eitz Yosef says, Bamidbar al hasmada v'kiyam b'ispaydus v'shmirasei atzricha. The desert is typically a place that we see as a place of solitude. There aren't a lot of people there. And there is a necessity for solitude when it comes to studying the Torah. Person has to be ready to kind of separate themselves from all the action, everything that's going on, to dedicate themselves to Torah, to dedicate themselves to mitzvahs very often, to make sure that they're not necessarily going to be influenced by bad friends or bad influences. There's a certain idea of hisbodedus, of solitude, that a person has to be ready to endure in order to be able to study and live Torah. And that's, he says, what the desert represents. So according to the Eitz Yosef, you have the fire representing something of that's not that's not simple and just something that you can see clearly, but something that's light, something that's fine, something that you have to think deep into, and something that you have to think about in certain abstract ways of thinking. Water represents the energy and the effort that goes into studying and living by Torah, and the desert represents the solitude that's necessary to study and live by Torah. That is how the Eitz Yosef explains. Uh, Another explanation for this is offered by the Shem Shmuel. The Shem Shmuel explains also again that these three elements represent three things that a person needs for living a life of Torah. And he explains fire as representing what we call hislahavas, which means a bread, an excitement, a fiery flame, that a person should be excited and enthusiastic about studying Torah and living a life of Torah. A person's Yiddishkeit should be a flame. It should be a person should be on fire. A person should be excited and energetic and enthusiastic about living Torah. Water actually represents the idea of cooling down. Yeah, a person has to have an excitement and an energy and a fire when it comes to living a life of Torah, but you also have to have an element of calm, of cooling down. Water cools things down. Water can actually be very quiet and still. In order for a person, that represents a person has to have clarity of thought. A person has to be able to have peace of mind, to have clarity of thought, to be able to think through the words of Torah and to live a life of Torah. Very important to have a peace of mind and a clear way of thinking that comes with a certain sense of calmness. That is what water represents. And the desert a desert is a desolate place. Things don't grow there. It's not a materialistic place. And that's the idea of the desert, that a person has to be willing to give up from their materialism and their and physical gratification in order to study Torah and to live by Torah properly. The desert is desolate from any kind of materialism, and we have to also separate ourselves from. Shmuel explains the three elements. And Reb Meir Shapiro of Lublin, who was the innovator of the idea of Daf Yomi, the page of Gemara that's learned every day by people all around the world. He was the Rebbe of Lublin. He started Lublin, Poland. He started a very famous yeshiva there, and he explained the three elements here in a very interesting way. The three elements actually represent three historical periods of the Jewish people, or actually three events that we find in the Torah. And these three events all come together to show or to bring out different dimensions of what we call Mesiras Nefesh. Mesiras Nefesh means self-sacrifice. The ultimate self-sacrifice is for a person to give up their life for Hashem. But there are other levels of self-sacrifice. Sometimes we have to give up our money in the service of Hashem. Sometimes we have to be able to give up ourselves in order to do a mitzvah, not to perform a sin, not to get back at someone that wants to get us. That's all self-sacrifice. We're giving up from ourselves to be able to serve Hashem. And Meir Shapiro explained that self-sacrifice manifests itself in three ways, three necessary ways. There are times when an individual has to practice self-sacrifice. An individual may have to give up his life to serve Hashem. An individual may have to give up a lot from themselves in order to be able to do mitzvahs. There's a necessity for an individual to be ready to be Moser Nefesh, to sacrifice from himself to serve Hashem. And then you have a time where it's not just up to an individual to be Moser Nefesh, to give up from themselves. Sometimes you have a group of people. You have many people. You have communities. You have a nation that sometimes has to be ready, has to practice self-sacrifice for the purposes of serving Hashem. And then there's a situation where the self-sacrifice that has to be practiced isn't just a one-shot deal. If a person has to give up their life for Hashem, it happens once and that's it. And there are certain situations where the situation calls for a one-time Mesiras Nefesh, a one-time self-sacrifice. But sometimes the situation calls for a constant self-sacrifice. Sometimes a person can find themselves in a state where self-sacrifice is constant, day by day, continuous. Those are the three types of self-sacrifice that a Jew has to be ready to do to serve Hashem as an individual, as a community, or on a consistent basis. And Rameir Shapiro explained that the three elements that the Torah was given represent these three facets of self-sacrifice that are needed in order to live a life of Torah. The fire represents the story of Avraham Avinu. We know that Avraham Avinu came to believe in Hashem on his own. The king Nimrod at the time told him to abandon the belief in Hashem, or else he's going to throw him into a burning furnace. Avram refused. He was thrown into the fire, and the miracle happened and he was saved. But he was ready to give up his life for his belief in Hashem. That's an example of an individual being ready to give up of himself for the service of Hashem. When the Torah was given with fire, it meant to be a symbol, a reminder of Abraham's willingness, of the individual who was ready to give up his life in the service of Hashem. Then you have the water. The water represents what happened at the splitting of the Red Sea. The Jewish people were surrounded on all sides. Desert, the sea, the Egyptians. They had nowhere to turn. What did Hashem tell Moshe to tell the Jewish people? Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yiso. Tell the Jewish people, travel, go into the water. And we know the first person to jump into the water was a man named Nachshon ben Aminadav, but he wasn't the only one. There were many others who followed after him. I think according to some versions, it was the tribe of Yehuda. Others said it was the tribe of Binyamin. But there are different versions of who else jumped in with him. But it wasn't something he did on his own. And it wasn't something that was supposed to be just done by him. Hashem told Moshe, tell the Jewish people so. They need to travel into the water. Go into the water. Be ready to do what I tell you to do, even if it means that you're endangering yourselves. And it's not like the second that Nachshon ben Aminadav jumped into the water split. Actually, it says that he almost drowned before the water split. That was an example of where many people had to practice self-sacrifice to serve Hashem. And then the desert represents the third dimension of self-sacrifice, which is the dimension of self-sacrifice on a continuous basis. And I've seen this idea in many places, and every time I say it, it's something that I find very, very surprising. But I've seen it in many places. Where do we find an example in the Torah of a continuous basis of self-sacrifice? Where do we find it? And the answer, says Rameir Shapiro, is the Jewish people in the desert. For 40 years, they had to practice self-sacrifice to follow Hashem in the desert. There were times they wanted to turn around and go back. Being in the desert for 40 years was not a simple thing. It required self-sacrifice. Because after all, it was a desert. There was no ability for the people on their own to sustain themselves. And as much as we think, wow, they had the clouds of glory surrounding them, and they had the mun, and they had the be'er, the well of water. They lived a miraculous life. They never do anything. But they had to be ready to put their trust in Hashem that they're going to survive this. And that wasn't an easy thing to do, apparently. And therefore, the example of a continuous state of self-sacrifice are the Jewish people in the desert for 40 years. That's what the desert represents. So according to Rameir Shapiro, the three elements mentioned that the Torah was given represent the three types of self-sacrifice that you have to be ready to practice in order to serve Hashem. There's the fire, which reminds us of Abraham, the individual, being ready to give up his life in the service of Hashem. We have the water representing when the Jewish people jumped into the water before it split. That was a communal, that was many people practicing Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice. And the desert represents the Jewish people, 40 years in the desert, 40 years of self-sacrifice of themselves to Hashem, following him in the desert for 40 years. Those are the three the three elements, what the three elements represent. Okay, that's the first part of the Medrash. Then the Medrash concludes Davar Acher, another explanation as to what is the symbolism behind the desert. And that is, as it's called, Mi she'ena isa atzmei kamidbar hefker. If you don't make yourself like a desert, don't make yourself hefker, ownerless, valueless, like the desert, and that person will be unable to acquire the words of Torah. And what that means is that the desert, again, is an ownerless place. Sorry about that. The desert is an ownerless place. It's a valueless place. A person has to ready to make themselves hefker, to make themselves valueless. What does it mean, valueless? It means to be humble. It means not to make a fuss about yourself, not to value yourself, your you, your physical you, and to be full of yourself, to be caught up in yourself. It means a person should be humble. And humble, says the Yosef, means that a person is humble and ready to learn Torah from anyone and to teach Torah for anyone. Because Torah is not found amongst people who are haughty, who are arrogant, who are self-centered. A person has to make himself like a desert, ownerless, valueless. No fuss about don't make a fuss about yourself. Don't get caught up in yourself. Don't make such a big fuss about yourself. Of course, you have value. But to take that value to the point of being haughty, being caught up in yourself, that is what the Torah in the desert meant to tell us. Make yourself like a desert. Be humble. And be humble means be ready to study Torah from anyone. It's never below you to study Torah from anyone. And it's never below you to teach Torah to anyone who wants to study Torah. That is the other explanation that the Medrash gives for why the Torah was given in the desert. Now, once we're on the subject of Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice, I'm going to share with you a very interesting idea. And that is that, as I mentioned, Hashem told Moshe, in Pasuk Beis, Hashem tells Moshe to count the Jewish people. In Pasuk Gimel, the Pasuk reads, Meben Esher Mashana V'Mala, from 20 years and up, Chol Yitzei Tzava B'Yisrael, all those who go out into the army of Israel, Tifkelu V'Yisam Tzeva Ata Ba'arayin, you and Aaron should count them according to their regions. So the age that the Jewish people were counted from or the age of of those who were to be counted was from 20 years and up, those who enter the army of the Jewish people. Now, the Sefer Iturei Torah, which is a compilation of it's a collection of different thoughts on the Parsha, uses these words of all those who go into the army to share a very interesting little story about Jewish soldiers. And there are many very fascinating ideas applied or told about Jewish soldiers and their Mesiras Nefesh and their self-sacrifice. Let us understand that 100 years ago or more, even less, to be drafted into the Russian army, the Polish army, for an observant Jew to be put in the army, very, very difficult thing to go through. The truth is, and I think of the American army years ago, wasn't so simple either. But especially in Russia or in Europe, 100 or so years ago, if an observant Jew landed up in the army, he was in terrible shape, especially in the Russian army. What they did to you there, and especially when it came to the Russian army. We know that the Russian army was infamous for kidnapping young Jewish boys or drafting young Jewish boys, keeping them in the army for years and years and years, till they came back lacking. They became back broken people who forget that Yiddish, they lost so much of their Judaism. They came back like Gentiles. They didn't even come back like human beings. They were broken. They lost a lot of their humanity. But some of them retained their Jewish identity and observance as much as possible. And we find that they were very highly praised for doing so. But again, I don't even know if it was only an issue when it came to the Russian army a couple hundred years ago, 100 or more years ago. A Jew who found himself and was drafted into any army was in very serious shape. And on these words called Yotzei Tzava B'Yisrael, the Yitur Torah brings the following story. There was a famous Hasidic Rebbe known as the Reb Chaim Tzanzer, Reb Chaim of Tzanz. And he had a son who was also a Hasidic Rebbe, and he was known as Rabbi Cheskel of Shinova. Cheskel of Shinova had a grandson that was drafted into the army. And Rabbi Cheskel's son came to his father to tell him what had happened. Now his father should daven that he be freed somehow from this draft. Rabbi Cheskel said to his son, he said, let me tell you the following. I was once visiting with the great tzaddik, Reb Meir Parmeshlan, so a famous Hasidic Rebbe. And he one time invited me to eat dinner with him, and we sat there together till late into the night. And suddenly his attendant came in and said, there's a Jewish soldier passing through our city with a group of soldiers, and he wants to come in to receive a blessing. And Reb Meir Parmeshlan immediately said, bring him in immediately. And after Reb Meir asked the soldier what he's doing and what he needs, he gave him a very warm and heartfelt blessing. And when the soldier left, Reb Meir Parmeshlan turned to Reb Cheskel of Shinova, and he said to him, no, Mashiach will come, not in my merit, not in your merit, and not on the merit of anybody like us, rather than the merit of the Jewish soldiers. And what that means is that these Jewish soldiers, to remain Jewish in the state that they were in, to remain Jewish under the conditions they were in, was a very unique thing. Was this soldier as great a person as the Tzaddik Reb Meir Parmeshlan, Reb Cheskel of Shinova? He wasn't as great as them. He wasn't as learned as them. Not even as righteous as them. But one thing he had, one thing he was doing, that Reb Meir Parmeshlan, Reb Cheskel of Shinova were not doing. They were not being Jewish in the army. This was a challenge that this soldier was dealing with, that any Hasidic Rebbe or any tzaddik never had to deal with. Everybody in life has challenges, but there are certain people who have very unique challenges. And the mere fact that they remain Jewish, they retain some kind of Jewish identity, is a tremendous feat and a tremendous merit. And as the Tzaddik Reb Meir Parmeshlan said, those are the people that bring Mashiach. Those people who remain Jewish under such trying and hostile circumstances, those are the people that will bring Mashiach. Are they as, again, hard to use the word great, but are they as righteous, as great, as holy as other people? Maybe not. But they have a certain dimension of holiness that other people don't. And that is to remain Jewish under such hostile and such trying circumstances. Those are the people who will bring Mashiach. And with this, we can answer a very interesting question. Every day, more than once a day, many times a day, we daven for the coming of Mashiach. And I one time heard a question. How can we daven for Mashiach? How can we even dare to expect that our prayers for Mashiach are going to be answered? There were people, many generations of people that were greater and holier than we are, than we will ever be. They davened for Mashiach. Their prayers weren't answered. So what makes us think that our prayers are going to be answered? Now, it's possible to answer this in many different ways. But according to what we just said, we can answer the following. The more we stay in exile and Gullus, the less we are able to produce in the service of Hashem. Now, in some ways, we may look at ourselves and say, "Whoa, look at all the things that we have in our in our Yiddishkeit." And it's true. There are certain aspects of our Jewish lives that we have that generations before didn't have. There have never been so many Jewish children getting a Torah education. The number of people that study Torah in yeshivas, there was never this many people, or not at least for a very long time. At the same time, we know that there are certain levels of Torah and the fulfillment of mitzvahs that we're still very far back, very far behind our grandparents and great-grandparents and back even further. There's certain levels of accomplishment in Torah and in service of Hashem that actually we don't get near what earlier generations fulfilled. And the longer we stay in Gullus, the harder it is. The longer we stay in Gullus, we actually produce and accomplish less. The longer we stay in Gullus, the harder it is. And the harder it is for us to fulfill the mitzvahs of the Torah. I mean, we have a rule. Every generation gets smaller. And if every generation gets smaller, that means that there is a large aspect of our service to Hashem that becomes smaller, that we don't accomplish the same amount as at earlier generations. At the same time, though, we're doing it under circumstances that the previous generations didn't have to face. The longer we stay in Gullus, the more difficult the conditions are. But we're still doing something under those conditions. And our ancestors never had to deal with these kinds of conditions. So even if we're producing less, but we're producing it under circumstances that no one ever had to face, no one ever had to deal with. And therefore, even if we see in many ways how smaller we are, but we are unique, that the fact that we've been doing that much under these circumstances is special. It was something that previous generations never had to face. So although we may be smaller, but we have something that other generations didn't have. We are producing under these trying circumstances that previous generations never had to deal with. And that makes our service of Hashem unique. It has a special merit. It has the merit of the Jewish soldiers of producing whatever we can under trying circumstances, under circumstances that others have never had to deal with. That is a unique form of serving of Hashem. That is a special merit. And therefore, we can daven for Mashiach, because we have a unique merit to bring Mashiach, just as Rabbi Cheskel Shinabah said of the Jewish soldiers. May our prayers and our hopes for Mashiach come very, very soon. Thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful night.